Hey guys, back at you with part 2 of The Boys on the Tracks, a case from the vault of the television show Unsolved Mysteries, and this is about former professional wrestler Billy Jack Haynes, who claimed that he was on the tracks that night and he had actually participated in putting the boys on the tracks. So, I've taken some notes on Billy's background and his story, and I know Billy Jack Haynes. I didn't know him beforehand, like from way back when I was like big into wrestling, because he had already retired by the time I had watched wrestling. I think I started watching in '98, and he retired in 1996. So he had retired a couple years before I started watching, and I mainly watched WWF, WWE. So he was already gone from the company by the time that I watched. So there's going to be a lot of wrestling talk, wrestling terms, which I will explain here and there. So I mean, if you're not into wrestling and stuff like that, like, sorry about that, but I mean, it's an important part of the case. But I mean, I think even if you're not a wrestling fan, you'll find it interesting because Billy Jack is a very interesting character. He said a lot of stuff over the years that is very questionable, and I don't have all that in my notes here, but I've obviously researched a lot over the years, and I've researched his thoughts, or not his thoughts, but his story about the Boys on the Tracks case and his claims, and among other things that he said over the years, just because of being interested in the case and just being a wrestling fan. Like, I know quite a lot about him. Not a lot, but I know like a lot of his stories and stuff like that he said over the years. So I'll get into that as best as I can, as well as other claims that he's made. And yeah, we'll just give some thoughts on him, and I'll take a little sip of water, and then we'll get started. Oh, but one thing before I get started, I went to say this in the last video, but last year, or a couple years ago, I bought a gaming laptop, so this is kind of a channel update. I'm looking into getting a mic and possibly doing some more like, kind of like podcast audio type videos, more with some like a slideshow type clip, like with pictures and stuff, like how some people do with true crime in the true crime community. So that's what I'm looking into doing eventually. I'm not sure when that'll happen. I gotta learn how to edit and all that kind of stuff, because I've obviously never learned that. With these videos, I've always just kind of given my thoughts raw, live, kind of just me talking in front of the camera like I am right now. And but yeah, I've seen other people say this in the comments in the years about kind of getting a better mic and stuff like that. And yeah, I think that's a good idea. So I have a mic that I want to get on Amazon, and I'll probably get that maybe next month or pretty soon, like within the coming weeks. And then eventually, I don't know when, but somewhere down the line, once I kind of get everything down, I'll get into trying to make more higher quality videos. But yeah, so let's get into this. So Billy Jack started his wrestling career at age 28. He was trained by legendary Canadian wrestling promoter Stu Hart, who owned Stampede Wrestling in Calgary. So Stu Hart, if you're Canadian and a wrestling fan, you know who Stu Hart is. He's the father of Bret Hart, who wrestled in the WWF. He was a big name in the WWF. If you're a wrestling fan, you obviously know who Bret Hart was. He's also the father of Owen Hart, who was another star in the WWF, who tragically passed away in an accident at WWF Over the Edge 1999 when he fell into the ring after the equipment malfunctioned, and that was a really sad and tragic case, and it had a lot of impact on the family. But so yeah, he was the father of Bret and Owen, and the father-in-law to Dynamite Kid, British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, and Jim Neidhart. He trained numerous wrestlers. Obviously, he trained his sons. He trained Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Chris Benoit, who you may or may not know that name if you're a wrestling fan, or you're not a wrestling fan, you may know that name, because there was a horrific tragedy that happened in 2007, which I'll be going into that later on, because Billy Jack made some real disturbing claims about that in a interview that he did in 2009. So I'll go into that later. But just remember the name Chris Benoit, because I'll be getting into that a little bit later. He also trained Brian Pillman, who was another famous wrestler who wrestled in WCW and the WWF. he trained a lot of guys. And Stu Hart was, he was the he was a very like he was one of the best trainers of all time. A lot of people speak highly of him, and so he owned Stampede Wrestling, and he trained Billy Jack Haynes. So after a couple years in Stampede Wrestling, he traveled back to the U.S. because he's from Portland, Oregon, in 1984 for Championship Wrestling from Florida. WCCW, which is World Class Championship Wrestling, which was a organization based in Texas. Portland Wrestling, which is where Billy Jack is from. And of course the WWF, now WWE, which now and even back then, because Vince McMahon took the company national, is the is the biggest wrestling company in the world. And basically back then in the 80s, there was a territory system which was called the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. And the National Wrestling Alliance, there was different territories. So New York was the WWF. Georgia was Jim Crockett Promotions, which later became WCW, which you obviously, if you're a wrestling fan, you know what WCW is, you know what Jim Crockett Promotions was. WCCW was another promotion that was included in the NWA. It was all these different territories, and back in the 80s, guys would come there, and they would work in these territories, and then they would go to different territories. So it was kind of like the shared territory system where guys would come in, and they all worked under one banner. But then eventually, when Vince McMahon bought the company from the WWF, as it was at the time, from his father, he eventually broke away from the WWF, or from the NWA, and went into other territories, which was something you didn't do back in the 80s. And he poached talent from different territories and started running shows in different territories, and so, the rest is history. He made WWE what it is today. And so that's kind of a brief summary of how things were back then. And WCW, which was Jim Crockett Promotions, also broke away from the NWA and became the second biggest wrestling company for a while. And they had the Monday Night Wars in the 1990s, and that whole kind of feud with the WWF and WCW kind of went back and forth until 2001, when WCW went out of business, because it was TNT, which was owned by Ted Turner, because Ted Turner bought WCW from Jim Crockett Promotions, and there was a merger between AOL and Time Warner. I feel like I'm going off in a whole different wrestling connection video. I don't mean to do that because this is a totally different thing. But basically, Ted Turner bought WCW, and he feuded with the WWF, and then eventually Ted Turner's company was merged with Time Warner, or AOL and Time Warner. They merged as one company, and AOL and Time Warner didn't like wrestling, and eventually Ted Turner was ousted from his company and owned very little of the company after the merger, and he was ousted. And then the executives at Time Warner and AOL didn't like wrestling, so they sold the company to Vince McMahon, and the rest is history. And so, yeah, sorry about that little wrestling tangent. That may happen quite a bit in this video, just because obviously me being a big wrestling fan and knowing quite a bit about it, because I've been watching for almost 30 years. Billy Jack, he won some belts in the previous territories that he worked. I think he won a couple of world championships in a couple of different territories. I think he was a tag team champion in a couple of different territories. So he definitely had some success, for sure. But when he joined the WWF in 1985 to 1988, when he originally came in, he feuded with Macho Man Randy Savage for the WWF Intercontinental title, though he never won that belt or any other belt in the promotion. And I'd consider him kind of like a mid-card wrestler, which a mid-card wrestler, I mean, there's different things in wrestling. There's the kind of like the enhancement talent, the jobbers as they're referred to, which those are the types that usually lose matches to the bigger stars. And then there's the mid-card talent, which I would classify Billy Jack was. And I think Billy Jack was kind of like, I'd say with mid-card, there's a lower tier of mid-card, and then there's mid-card where you're like middle of the card, and then there's upper mid-card. So lower tier mid-card would be they lose the majority of their matches. Middle of the card would be like they win, they lose some matches, and then upper mid card. They win the majority of their matches, and there's the Intercontinental title, which is classified as a mid card title, which people feud for, and a lot of people consider the Intercontinental title to be kind of like the next step to the WWE title or the WWF title back then. And I think Billy Jack was kind of more so a mid card guy. He won some matches, he lost some matches, and he really didn't work for the promotion that long. He only worked there for a few years. And he was definitely the type that like Vince McMahon would like, because Vince McMahon, especially back in the 80s, was always a fan of bigger guys, like these big muscle bound superhero type guys, superhero looking type guys, like the Ultimate Warrior. And Billy Jack was definitely one of those guys. So I wonder if he would have stuck around longer in the company, if he would have been more of a main event star. I don't know. It's hard to say, because he had a lot of drug issues and stuff like that back then, and has continued to up until he got arrested, which I'll get into that a little bit later too. So he ended up leaving the WWF in 1988 after refusing to lose a match in his hometown of Portland, Oregon, which I'm not 100% sure if that's accurate or not. That's what I found online, but other people have said his leaving of the WWF was related to an incident that happened on the plane, where like he had passed out or something, or he had some kind of medical emergency. And he was advised not to continue wrestling, and I think Vince McMahon wanted him to wrestle after that, but then he couldn't. But then he said no, because he wasn't going to wrestle after that. Whatever happened to him, he might have had like I don't know, but there was some kind of medical emergency he had on the plane. He was advised not to wrestle. So I don't know which story is true, if he left because he refused to lose a match, or if he left because of that. Who knows? I mean, you never know in the wrestling business, because when guys do interviews like that, there's all sorts of stories, and you don't really know what's true and what's not. So, but he would continue wrestling in different promotions up until his retirement in 1996. So, yeah, so he retired a couple of years before I started watching. So, I mean, I didn't really know who he was up until probably 15 years ago, I would say, is when I started to know about him. And so here's what everybody's for. Sorry about the 12 minutes of wrestling talk. This is Billy's story about the boys on the tracks. So, Billy claims he was there the night the boys were murdered. He said he was hired to take out 2 Arkansas state cops who were stealing drug drops that were worth $2 to $4 million. He said he was at the drop site when the drop was made, which he said that the drop went well, and that nobody, it looked like nobody had showed up to steal it. And he said it was successful. So, he said witnesses have corroborated what he said 30 years later. He said he saw the boys being beaten up by 2 cops. He says the drop had taken place 100 to 120 feet from the tracks. He says the cops were on the tracks using a phone. When they saw the boys, who took off, the cops ran after them and brought them back to the tracks. Which, a phone? Like, this is the 80s, right? So this was before I was born. As far as I know, the only kind of cellular phones they had in the 80s were those big gray portable phones that I remember seeing on Saved by the Bell that Zach Morris would have. Like, I think those were kind of the only phones that they had back then that were portable, and they probably weren't that well. So I don't know, like, this was, I think, in the woods. Like, it happened around the woods. So would that even have like that kind of good of reception? Like, I don't know. That makes me wonder about that. Like, I don't know. I just have a hard time believing that. So unless maybe he was confusing it for a radio or something, which is what it could have been. You know, I don't know. I don't know who the cops would have even been talking to, but yeah, he said they were on the tracks using a phone. So Billy said that the cops previously beat the boys with their flashlights and came back with the boys over their shoulders. And the cops dropped the boys on the tracks and then proceeded to put them on the tracks. He states Don Henry was already dead and Kevin Ives was still alive. The cops said they wanted no witnesses. Billy says he didn't want the boys to be killed. He said one of the cops took the rifle and hit Kevin in the back of the head with the butt of the rifle, splitting his head wide open, killing him instantly. Though an autopsy report states Kevin had been struck in the head and Don tried to run, and that's when he was stabbed in the back. So that contradicts his story, because I looked up the autopsy report before I started doing this video a little bit, and I didn't really make notes on it, but there's a lot of like stuff that's redacted from it and very suspicious. Like it's like the Epstein files almost. Like there's just like a lot of stuff redacted, and I think what I just said there about Don Henry tried to run and then was stabbed in the back, I think that was from witnesses that corroborated that story, that like this story of him running. So I don't know. I mean, like I said, this is another thing about Billy Jack. He says certain things and it's tough to believe, and we'll go more into that later. So he claims he helped put the boys on the tracks. Billy states he was under a mask and gloves, and that he was there with the sheriff. He claims he went down there after a match with King Kong Bundy in Detroit. He claims that other wrestlers have stated in interviews that he wrestled after that. Though he says he didn't wrestle until the 28th. But I looked this up, and I don't know if he's lying or if he just doesn't remember. He has, like I said, he has a lot of he's had a lot of drug issues throughout his life, as well as concussion issues, so maybe he's not remembering well. But there's a site called History of WWE, and on History of WWE, they have the results of every match card of every year, whether it's a live event or a televised show. And Billy Jack Haynes actually wrestled Rip Oliver in San Francisco at a WWF Wrestling Challenge taping on the 25th. So, like I said, I don't know if he's remembering that, or maybe this was taped before then. I don't know, but he did. It shows that he wrestled on the 25th. So he's not exactly accurate when he says that he wrestled on the 28th. He claims that what happened was documented. He also claims that the rifle used in the murder was never recovered, which I also question, because in the Unsolved Mysteries segment, Don Henry's father, Curtis, says that Don wouldn't have left the rifle in the gravel where it was found. So that's also kind of a hole in Billy Jack's story, because, and I mean, I can't confirm that it was found, but I'm assuming that it was found because, like I said, Curtis Henry made that comment about the rifle being in the gravel, so that's what I'm assuming. I'm assuming it was found. So that's another thing about another hole in Billy Jack's story. He claimed in later interviews as well, he says he got paid $50,000 for that night, because he was there to kill 2 cops. I don't know if he actually did that or not. He didn't really go into detail about that. I think. Well, no, I guess since the drops weren't, like the drug drops weren't stolen, that he didn't have to kill anybody. So, but yeah, he was paid for that job, and he's done other interviews about this since then. Like as far as I know, after this one interview, which is where I got all the information, which I will give the credit to that. That was taken from, a lot of my notes are made from his interview with Hannibal, who is also another wrestler that does interviews with wrestlers, and that's on the Hannibal TV channel, and I'll leave links to that, as well as some other links. Like there's another guy called I'm blanking on the one guy's channel, but there was a guy that like really dove deep into this case, as well as the claims of Billy Jack. And I'd suggest looking at that video, and if I remember, I'll leave links to that, as well as different interviews that Billy Jack has done. But so yeah, a lot of this was taken from the Hannibal TV, just because it was kind of a shorter like clip, and I was able to jot down a lot more. But yeah, so he was claimed in other interviews that he was hired by Bill Clinton, who was I think he was the governor of Arkansas at the time in the 80s, before he was president, to do the job in Arkansas, which I find very hard to believe. Because also, and not in this interview with Hannibal, but in another interview, he claims that he was actually talking to Bill Clinton on the phone. And that Bill Clinton said, you know, like Billy didn't want to kill the kids, but then Bill Clinton was like, no witnesses, no witnesses. And he claims that he heard Hillary on the phone saying no witnesses as well. And he also claims that night, too, that he was recording it with a camera. And obviously back then, you know, it's not like we had today. It's not like we have today where the cameras are small or we have cameras on our phones or iPads or whatever. You know, back then they had those big, like almost like TV cameras almost is what they were. Those big like JVC cameras. And he says that he had like 7 or 8 seconds of footage or something like that of the boys being put on the tracks. But then later it was, he said that the video of that incident was either lost or stolen from his car or something like that. So it's like there's another hole in his story about this whole like footage of the tracks being gone. I don't know. I find that hard to believe too. And now I'll go into a lot of his conspiracy theories, which well, no, hold on. He actually met with Linda Ives, who was Kevin Ives' mother, and I guess his father too, because they talked about his father, and I guess Billy brought up that there was like that Linda originally believed him, but then like she like kind of like really eventually not believed him and stopped taking his calls and stuff. And apparently there was some kind of like documentary they were doing that apparently was going to be featured on Netflix or something, but then that didn't pan out. And yeah, I mean, this story is hard to believe. And I mean, Billy Jack himself in that same interview has said that he looked up as much as he could on the case on the internet, as well as read the books, or read a book based on it and highlighted different passages because he wanted to come out and prove the things that were false about the case with his story that he supposedly had. So that just goes to show he's probably full of shit when it comes to this, when it comes to his story about the case, because obviously a lot of his stuff, and even with my little bit of research I've done, it's easy to, you know, you can find stuff easily on the internet and through YouTube. Like, they cover it a lot in the Unsolved Mysteries segment. There's a lot of stuff you can find on Google. I found the autopsy report that claims a lot of this stuff that Billy Jack is saying. So, I think he just, I don't know. I don't know whether he made it up to kind of make himself relevant or what he was trying to do, but it's sad because, you know, I'm pretty sure Linda Ives passed away a few years ago, so it's like, you know, she went to her grave, as far as I know, not knowing what happened. I mean, at least she didn't believe Billy Jack Haynes anymore, but, you know, it's very strange and very sad that he would go that route and put himself in this whole murder situation. But yeah, so he has done other interviews, and I brought up the name Chris Benoit, and there's a reason I brought up that, because it pertains to Billy Jack Haynes. So, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's these thing called shoot interviews. And basically what a shoot is it's something out of character that's off the script. Like, in wrestling, obviously, we all know it's predetermined, it's scripted entertainment. We've known that, you know, since Vince McMahon came out in the 1980s and said that, you know, and I'm sure people have even known that before that. It's scripted entertainment. And sometimes people will do these shoot promos, like if they're in the interview if they're in the ring talking, sometimes people will go off script, and they call that a shoot. And what a shoot interview is technically something that's an out of character interview, where they talk about their careers and different stories and stuff like that. And Billy Jack is notorious for these shoot interviews. And he did one in about 2009, and in this interview, he claimed that Chris Benoit, who was a wrestler in the WWE, who I mentioned was trained by Stu Hart, and he also wrestled in WCW. I'll go into that first. So Chris Benoit, you know, was a wrestler who wrestled in the WWF and WCW. And one day in June of 2007, he took the lives of himself, his wife, and his son. And Billy Jack claimed in an interview with RF Video, which was a company and still is a company, I believe, that does shoot interviews. I don't know if they still do or not, but they did back then. Because before I go into it, shoot interviews, they're not really as much of a thing anymore because a lot of guys have YouTube channels and podcasts, so they do them that way now. But back then, shoot interviews were very popular. So Billy Jack had went in and basically said that like Vince McMahon was responsible for it, and that he killed them. He killed Chris and his wife Nancy and their son Daniel because Vince McMahon was sleeping with Nancy and was actually the father of Daniel, which is like the most ridiculous thing you could ever like say. Because if you look at Daniel Benoit, which is Chris's son, he looks exactly like Chris. So like for him to say that is stupid. And he claimed in another interview that he was on drugs during the time of that interview. And this was I think in 2013 maybe. So a few years later. He claimed he was on drugs, but still stands behind what he said in that interview. That he believed what he said in that interview. And also in that original interview with RF Video, at the time, because of the Chris Benoit case, the business was under a lot of scrutiny. A lot of guys had passed away because they'd either taken their own lives or they had gotten addicted to drugs. Because in the 80s and 90s, guys were on the road a lot, and concussions and stuff like that, and injuries like that, guys hid, and guys were taking drugs and drinking and doing a lot of stuff. And in the 90s, when I was watching, guys were taking shots to the head, which with chairs and stuff like that, and that obviously caused CTE. That's what is theorized in the Chris Benoit case, was that he had a very bad case of CTE. Like they did an autopsy of his brain, which said he had the brain of an 80-year-old man with Alzheimer's, and that's what they theorized, was that the CTE caused him to do that, which is very very similar with other cases with football players and hockey players and boxers and stuff like that. So, and that's what I tend to do. That's what I tend to lean towards too, is CTE. And I may do a video on that case at some point later down the line, because obviously being a wrestling fan, I'm pretty familiar with that case. But yeah, so Billy claimed all that, and but then he did, I think in another interview with Hannibal, he claimed that he said all this stuff about, Chris or Vince being the father and all that stuff because he wanted DNA from Vince McMahon. Because in that interview he said, Vince, you take a DNA test and I'll take a DNA test and blah 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 blah. So he claimed that he wanted Vince McMahon's DNA to prove that he was the brother of Vince McMahon, because he thinks excuse me, he thinks that Vince McMahon's father, Vincent J. McMahon, is the father of Billy Jack, which is very hard to believe. I don't believe that at all. There's no resemblance between Vince McMahon Sr. or Vince McMahon or Vincent J. McMahon, the Vince McMahon we know today, or Vincent K. McMahon, I should say, the Vince we know today, and Billy Jack. There's no resemblance at all. So I think he's, just not all there. And I mean, like I said, if you really look at the case, right, this whole thing with his conspiracy theories and stuff like that, like you can tell the guy's not all there. He's a few fries short of a happy meal. However you want to phrase it. But yeah, so he's claimed that. He claimed that 9/11 was an inside job. So he's just like very conspiracy theory minded, and I think a lot of that stuff he says to kind of get his name out there. And it's sad, and I think a lot of it has to do with it too. He's a known drug addict. He's had concussions, and because he was actually involved in a class action lawsuit against WWE, which happened in 2019, which I thought was a joke, because there was like all these former ex-wrestlers that were trying to sue WWE because of concussions, but then they had also worked for other promotions before WWE and after WWE. So it was all this big, it was all a big joke, and it never went anywhere. It got dismissed in court. But yeah, so like he's just said and done all these different things, and he said he's this big drug enforcer for, like I said earlier, Bill Clinton and like the mob and like all these other people, and it's just like it's hard to believe. I do believe he was a drug dealer at some point, but I don't think he was to this level of what he says that he is. I don't believe that. It's too fabricated, in my opinion. So, to conclude, we'll go with what I talked about in the last video about him. And about, I don't know, a couple years ago maybe, he was actually arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, who I think was like in her 80s. I think he's in his 70s and she was in her 80s or something like that, and she was found shot. I don't remember the exact date when this actually happened. But yeah, she was shot. And he claimed that he was smoking heroin when an intruder broke in, and I guess an intruder like taped them up and was trying to extort him for money, because I guess they had a bunch of money in the house, and like he goes on this big story about that. And in my opinion, I don't think it went down like that, because obviously with his concussions, because of CT, if he has CT, which I would imagine he would, because in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, concussions weren't really taken seriously at the time. Like, I can name one instance from hockey. I'm a big hockey fan, and there was a guy named Paul Correa. He played for the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, and he was hit by, I think, Scott Stevens from New Jersey, and he was out on the ice, and he had a visor on his helmet, and you could actually see the fog from his breath in his helmet, and he was knocked out. And nowadays, if something like that, after a huge hit like that would happen, there's a concussion protocol, and you guys would be taken off the ice and not played. But these days, or well, not these days, but back then, Paul Correa was taken off on a stretcher, but then came back later on in the day and continued to play. And he did an interview, and he claims that he has no memory of the rest of the game. And I think he even got a goal or something or a couple of goals or something like that. And he claims he has no issue, like he has no memory of what happened after the hit. And so that just goes to show that concussions weren't taken as seriously back then as they are now. And so I think Billy Jack, I think he has some CT. I think it's even mentioned that he has dementia or something like that. So he has a lot of issues and a lot of problems. And he was actually, I think a couple of years ago, or a year ago actually, he was deemed unfit to stand trial at the time. And I think just recently they've deemed him fit to stand trial now, which I think there's a trial stated for like 2027 or 2028. So I think I think like for the most part, he's going to be locked up in prison, and he's not going to get out, and he'll obviously pass in prison. And I mean, it's a sad case. It's a sad case all around. Like, but like it's the most sad thing is for him to put himself in this murder of the boys on the tracks. And yeah, it's just sad. It's a sad thing, but I think most people that have looked into it and like debunked a lot of his things and just like looked at him as a person and his interviews and stuff like that, like I have in this video, can pretty much say that he was lying, and there's a lot of things that contradict his story. And the one guy that I mentioned earlier that really dove deep into this case really dives deep into that and into him. So if you want more, because I don't know if I'm going to do more parts to this case. I probably won't, but maybe sometime down the line I might, because I know there's a lot of corruption in this case, and there's, like I said, with those redacted portions of the autopsy, like you can just tell there's a lot of cover up and a lot of suspiciousness when it comes to this case. So, but that guy goes really deep into it. So if I remember, I'll leave links into the video, as well as the Hannibal TV interview, which I got most of this information from, about like his story of being there that night. And so yeah, so that's pretty much my thoughts on Billy Jack Haynes and his story. I obviously don't believe it. I don't know if you guys believe it or not, but But yeah, I appreciate you guys sticking around, and the first part of the video seems to be doing pretty well. It's gotten, I think, 20 views in a couple of days. So I mean, that's pretty good to me. And I don't monetize the videos or anything like that. I don't believe in doing that. And I mean, with YouTube, it's hard to earn money from it anyway. So, but like I've always said, I mean, as long as people watch, I'll continue to do the videos, and that's why I'm doing this one today, because this one, or the last one, got 20 views, and we'll probably continue to. So, but yeah, I mean, that's pretty much my thoughts on Billy Jack Haynes and his story and who he is and his career and what he's said and done since then. Um, if you guys have any thoughts on him or the case or anything else, if you have recommendations as to what you want me to do for any other cases, whether it's Unsolved Mysteries related or not, whether there's other cold cases you want me to cover, put them in the comments. Let me know. And feel free to like and subscribe. And it's good to be back. It's good to be making videos again. I've missed doing it. It's been a lot of fun. Especially with these past couple of videos, it's been a lot of fun because the Boys on the Tracks is a case that I've wanted to do for a while, and I've known a lot about the Billy Jack Haynes stuff for a while. So it's something that I've definitely wanted to cover, and I'm glad that I wanted to, or that I finally done it. So yeah, like I said, share your thoughts. Keep watching the videos. Keep supporting. I think I'm gonna do videos, maybe every 1 to 2 months, probably. Maybe sometimes more if I'm in the mood. But yeah, I mean, you'll see. If you're subscribed, you'll see when I upload. But yeah, there's definitely gonna be more uploads, and yeah, I look forward to doing it. So that's it for me. And as I always say, see you in the next one.